palette of the undead. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of my studio, casting soft, warm light on the half-finished canvases that littered the space. The scent of oil paint mixed with the faint odor of turpentine filled the air, a familiar comfort in the solitude of my work. My name is Clein, and I'm a painter. For as long as I can remember, the studio had been my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in the flow of creativity, letting the outside world fade into insignificance. But today, the world refused to be ignored. It started like any other day. I woke early, brewed a cup of bitter black coffee, and stood for a moment at the window of my loft studio, high above the streets. I loved being up here, away from the noise and bustle, where the world seemed distant, almost unreal. My studio was perched 3 floors up in an old industrial building converted into artist spaces. The high ceilings and large windows made it the perfect place to work, the perfect escape. I had never imagined that one day it would become my prison. I had been working on a new piece, an abstract swirl of colors that danced across the canvas, trying to capture a fleeting sense of chaos. Ironic, looking back now, the brush in my hand moved with steady precision, blending hues of deep crimson into shades of muted gray. My mind was elsewhere, lost in the interplay of light and shadow. I didn't even notice the first scream. It was the second one that broke through my concentration, sharp and panicked, echoing from the street below. I paused, brush hovering over the canvas, my heart skipping a beat. What was that? Another scream followed, closer this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. My pulse quickened, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. I moved to the window, peering through the glass to the street below. At first, it was hard to see. The narrow alley that ran alongside the building was cast in shadow, the buildings on either side tall and imposing. But there, at the far end of the street, I saw movement. People running. They were frantic, shoving each other as they fled in all directions. And then I saw why. A group of them, maybe 10 or 12, stumbled after the crowd, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their clothes were torn, stained with dark patches that looked like blood. At first, I thought they were just hurt, victims of some kind of accident. But then I saw one of them lunge at a man who had fallen behind. It was fast, faster than it should have been, and it was on him in seconds, tearing at his flesh with an animalistic ferocity. I staggered back from the window, heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was happening? Was it some kind of riot? An outbreak of violence? But no, that didn't explain what I'd just seen. The way that person, no, that thing, had attacked without hesitation, without reason. I moved quickly, shutting the blinds and turning away from the window as if not seeing it would make it any less real. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Should I leave? Try to get out of the building? But where would I go? I had no family nearby, no close friends I could call for help. My life was here, in this studio, in my art. I was alone. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I scrolled through news feeds and social media trying to find some explanation. The headlines were terrifying. Unknown outbreak spreads rapidly, violence in the streets, stay indoors. Videos popped up of similar scenes across the city, people running, screaming, being attacked by those things. I dropped the phone on my desk, my mind spinning. The world had changed in an instant, and I had no idea what to do. I wasn't a fighter, I wasn't a survivor, I was a painter, for God's sake. What could I possibly do against something like that? The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my studio jolted me back to reality. They were quick, almost frantic, and they stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, hoping whoever it was would keep moving, but instead there was a knock. Sharp, urgent. My heart raced as I moved toward the door, my mind screaming at me not to open it. But what if it was someone who needed help? What if it was someone like me, scared and alone? I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. A man stood there, breathing heavily, his clothes disheveled. His eyes were wide with fear, darting down the hallway as if expecting something to come after him at any moment. "Please," he gasped, "let me in." Without thinking, I pulled the door open wider, stepping aside as he stumbled into the studio. He leaned against the wall, panting, his face pale and sweaty. "Are you okay?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "They're everywhere," he muttered, barely able to catch his breath. Those things, they're in the streets, in the buildings. I barely made it up here." I closed the door and locked it, my mind reeling. "What are they? What's happening?" He shook his head, sliding down to sit on the floor. "I don't know. Some kind of disease. People are turning into monsters, attacking each other. I saw it happen right in front of me." His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. I glanced around my studio, the once cozy creative space now feeling more like a cage. What were we supposed to do now? How long could we stay here? I moved to the window again, lifting the blinds just enough to peek outside. The street below was deserted now, but the chaos had left its mark. Overturned cars, shattered windows, and dark stains that painted a grim picture of what had happened. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "What's your name?" I asked, turning back to the man. He looked up, blinking as if he had forgotten where he was. "Michael," he said after a moment. "I'm Clein," I replied, sitting down across from him. "Do you live in this building?" He nodded. "Yeah, just below. I was trying to get out, but the stairs were full of them. I managed to get up here before they saw me." "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, but his eyes told a different story. There was something off about him, something that made my skin prickle with unease. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way he avoided eye contact, the way he kept glancing toward the door, set off alarm bells in my head. Before I could ask more, there was a loud crash from the hallway, the sound of something heavy slamming against a door. My heart leaped into my throat as Michael shot to his feet, his face pale. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a long metal rod I used to stretch canvases, and motioned for him to follow me. We moved quickly, pushing furniture in front of the door, trying to barricade ourselves in. My mind was racing, but there was no time to think, no time to plan. We were trapped. The pounding on the door grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the low, guttural growls that accompanied it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But then something changed. The pounding stopped, and for a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence. And then a scream. It came from right outside the door, a blood-curdling, agonized wail that sent chills down my spine. I glanced at Michael, who was backing away, his face twisted in fear. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned back toward the door just in time to see it buckle under the weight of something slamming into it. The barricade held, but barely, and the growling on the other side grew louder. "Michael, grab something," I shouted, my voice hoarse with panic. But he didn't move. Instead, he collapsed to the floor, clutching his side. His shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a deep bite wound on his abdomen. Blood oozed from the torn flesh, staining his clothes. My stomach dropped. "Oh no!" Michael looked up at me, his eyes wide and filled with fear. "I didn't want to tell you," he whispered. "I didn't want you to..." The door splintered inward with a sickening crack, the barricade barely holding as the force from the other side grew more violent. I could hear the heavy breathing, the guttural growls, and the unmistakable shuffle of feet, dozens of them. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Panic shot through me like an electric shock. Michael's groans grew louder, his body convulsing as the infection took hold. The sight of him writhing on the floor, the bite wound already blackening around the edges, made my stomach churn. I had seen videos, heard the rumors. People who were bitten didn't stay human for long. I stumbled back, heart racing, the metal rod gripped tightly in my trembling hands. My mind was spinning, torn between the horror in front of me and the imminent danger behind the door. "Michael," I managed to say, but the words felt hollow. His breathing grew shallow, each gasp more labored than the last. His skin was turning an unnatural shade of gray, and his eyes, once filled with fear, began to glaze over, like the light inside him was fading. The pounding on the door was relentless, the wood groaning under the pressure of whatever was trying to get in. But in that moment, my focus shifted entirely to Michael. He was no longer the scared man I'd let in. He was changing, right before my eyes. "Michael, no!" My voice cracked, fear seizing my throat. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept what was happening. But the truth was undeniable. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, like something else was taking control. His hands clawed at the floor, his head lolling to the side. His eyes snapped open, and when he looked at me, they were no longer the eyes of a man. They were empty, hollow, filled with nothing but hunger. "Shit," I muttered, taking a step back. My back hit the wall, and I realized I was out of space. The room suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating. I gripped the metal rod tighter, knowing what I had to do but dreading it with every fiber of my being. Michael let out a low, guttural groan, his body jerking upright in an unnatural, almost mechanical motion. He was no longer the man who had stumbled into my studio seeking help. He was something else now, something far more dangerous. He lunged at me. Instinct took over, and I swung the metal rod with all the strength I had. It connected with his jaw, the sickening crunch of bone and flesh echoing in the room. Michael staggered back, but only for a moment. His head snapped back into place with an unnatural twitch, and he came at me again, faster this time, his arms outstretched, fingers clawing for my throat. I swung again, harder this time, aiming for his temple. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, his body twitching violently before going still. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared down at him, my heart pounding in my ears. He wasn't moving. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, the weight of what I had just done settling in like a cold stone in my chest. I had killed him. No, I had killed whatever was left of him. There was no saving him. There was no saving anyone. But the danger wasn't over. The door, it was bending inward now, the top hinge barely holding on as the creatures outside pushed and clawed at it. I could hear them, groaning, snarling, their hunger palpable even through the thick wood. And it wasn't just one or two, it sounded like a horde. I needed to act fast. I grabbed a nearby easel and shoved it against the door, reinforcing the already weakened barricade. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy me some time. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My studio, once a haven of creativity, now felt like a death trap. Paint cans, brushes, blank canvases, nothing that would help against what was coming. Then I saw it, the large wooden storage cabinet on the far side of the room. It was heavy, solid. If I could tip it over in front of the door, it might hold them off long enough for me to figure out a plan. With adrenaline surging through my veins, I sprinted across the room and threw my shoulder into the side of the cabinet. It didn't budge. I gritted my teeth and pushed harder, my muscles screaming in protest. Slowly, it began to tip, the weight shifting as I gave it everything I had. The pounding on the door grew louder, more frantic. The creatures outside could sense that their way in was weakening. Come on, I muttered under my breath, sweat pouring down my face as I heaved the cabinet forward. Finally, with one last desperate push, the cabinet toppled over, crashing down in front of the door with a thunderous bang. Dust rose into the air, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to hope that it would be enough. But the groaning and pounding continued, unabated. I backed away, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. Michael was dead, really dead. The creatures outside were still trying to get in, and I was trapped with no way out. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the window on the opposite side of the room. I spun around just in time to see the glass shatter as something, or someone, climbed through. For a split second, I thought it was another one of those things. But then I saw him, a man, ragged and bloodied, scrambling through the broken window. He was breathing hard, his eyes wild with fear. "Help!" he gasped, collapsing onto the floor, blood oozing from a wound on his leg. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was he bitten? Was he going to turn like Michael? I rushed to his side, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in my gut. "What happened? Are you hurt?" He pointed behind him toward the window he had crawled from, the adjacent studio. I was hiding. In my place. They broke in. I saw the fire escape and thought... His voice trailed off as he noticed the makeshift barricade and the pounding on the door. "Oh God, they're here too, aren't they?" I nodded, my mind racing. The man was still catching his breath, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. He had risked his life climbing over to my studio, but why had he come alone? He looked up at me, his face pale. "Bitten. I didn't think they'd get me, but I was too slow." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I recoiled, stepping back instinctively. Another one, another person who had been bitten, who was going to turn into one of them. There was no time. I couldn't do this again. I couldn't watch another person die in front of me, watch them turn into a monster. But before I could act, before I could even think, the pounding on the door stopped. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket, thick and oppressive. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then the door burst open. I barely had time to react before they came flooding in, half a dozen of them, their eyes glassy, their mouths twisted into grotesque snarls. They were faster than I expected, their movements jerky but purposeful as they lunged toward us. The man on the floor screamed, his voice raw with terror, but he didn't get far. They were on him in seconds, tearing into his flesh with sickening ferocity. The sound of ripping, gnashing. Blood splattered across the floor, painting a horrific picture of what was to come. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, my body refusing to move as the scene played out in front of me. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch. Watch as the world around me fell apart. Let me know in the comments below if you want to hear more from this story. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.